Atlas arrived at Burning Man with nothing but a locked steel bird and a past no one could trace. By the time the phoenix sculpture burned, he had vanished, leaving behind only a perfect circle of scorched earth and whispers of the bodies it might have held. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a blistering sun, a vast expanse of cracked earth and shifting dust. For most of the year it was silent, an empty wasteland where only the wind and sand spoke. But once a year, it transformed into a city of fire, music, and strange beauty. Burning Man drew dreamers, wanderers, and thrill-seekers from all over the world, promising freedom from ordinary life. In 2019, the event was at its most spectacular. Giant art installations towered above the horizon, mutant vehicles shaped like dragons rolled across the playa, and at night, the sky glowed with explosions of color. To outsiders, it looked like pure magic. To those within, it was a carefully constructed illusion hiding something far darker. The first days of the festival passed without incident. Camps were filled with dancers, jugglers, and artists building their final works before the climactic burn. In the midst of this chaos stood a small, isolated corner where a man known only as Atlas had pitched his camp. No one knew his real name. His clothing was plain, his voice soft, and he kept mostly to himself. But what drew attention wasn't Atlas himself. It was the thing he brought with him. Rising from the center of his camp was a massive structure made of blackened steel rods twisted into the shape of a bird mid-flight, wings curled inward as though guarding something. The sculpture, which he called the Phoenix, was sealed with heavy locks and sheets of metal, making it impossible to see inside. When curious visitors asked about it, Atlas would only shake his head and walk away. The night it happened, the air was cool, and music from distant camps throbbed in the background. A faint shimmer of light could be seen from Atlas's corner, a glow too steady to be torchlight. Hours later, a strange haze began drifting across the playa. At first, people assumed it was just another fire performance or one of the festival's countless pyrotechnic displays. But those who wandered closer noticed something unsettling about the smell. It wasn't the sweet, woody scent of campfires or the sharp tang of fireworks. It was heavier, sour, and choking, clinging to the inside of the throat. Some who approached the source turned back immediately, unsettled by the heat and the way the ground seemed to shimmer unnaturally. Others lingered, snapping photos on their phones before being waved away by volunteers wearing reflective vests. By morning, word had spread that Atlas had vanished sometime during the night. His camp was abandoned, the phoenix sculpture blackened and warped, its locks twisted into molten lumps. Around it, the sand was perfectly scorched in a clean, circular outline, as though the fire had been deliberately contained. The festival issued a brief announcement over the loudspeakers, calling it an unfortunate accident involving a structural fire. No further details were given, and the crowds quickly returned to their celebrations. But in the quieter corners of the playa, whispers began. People said the fire wasn't an accident at all. They said the phoenix had been holding something, or someone, inside when it burned, and they said that whatever happened out there in the dark, the desert would keep its secret. For now. By midday, the site of Atlas ES camp had been cordoned off with thin plastic tape that flapped weakly in the desert wind. A few rangers stood watch, their sunglasses hiding whatever reaction they might have had to the charred remains of the phoenix. The structure's once sleek, curved wings had collapsed inward, their metal ribs warped and fused. At the base, blackened fragments littered the sand. From a distance, they could have been scraps of fabric or melted equipment. But those who got close enough swore the shapes were too irregular, like something organic reduced to brittle ash. The ground around it told a story the official announcement didn't. The scorch marks formed a perfect circle, their edge so sharp it looked as if the fire had been caged. Atlas's tent remained exactly as it had been the day before. The zipper was pulled shut, his sleeping bag neatly rolled, a half-eaten loaf of bread still wrapped in plastic. His water jugs were full. Nothing looked hurried or abandoned in panic. It was as though he had simply stepped out and never come back. But there was no sign of footprints leading away from the site, only the hard-packed dust swept clean by the wind. As the rangers inspected the debris, one knelt and lifted a jagged piece of blackened material. The edges crumbled at his touch, leaving a fine gray powder on his gloves. Without a word, he placed it into a sealed evidence bag and motioned for the others to keep searching. Their movements were efficient, mechanical, almost rehearsed, as though they knew exactly what they were looking for. Festival goers who passed by were told to move along, assured there was no danger, just routine cleanup after an art-related accident. But people had seen too much for that explanation to stick. Some whispered that they'd seen faint shapes through the gaps in the Phoenix S metal walls earlier in the week, shapes that moved or at least seemed to. Others swore that late at night, they had heard faint banging or scraping sounds coming from within the sculpture, though they'd dismissed it as part of the festival's strange performances. The official story spread quickly. A small fire caused by faulty lighting equipment, flames feeding on the sculpture's wooden supports before burning out naturally. Yet no one could recall the Phoenix having any wooden parts at all. And more troubling was the timing. The fire started just hours after a group of volunteers claimed to have seen Atlas meeting with two men near the outer edge of the festival grounds. No one knew who they were, and they didn't appear in any of the camp registration logs. By the second day, the area was cleared. The remains of the Phoenix were dismantled and hauled away under a black tarp, loaded into a truck that drove straight out of the desert without stopping. No press, no public statements, no photographs released. It was as if the festival wanted the incident erased before the week was even over. But the scorch marks in the sand stayed visible for days, a perfect dark ring that seemed to resist the wind, as though it didn't want to be buried. Those who stood too close to it swore the air there still smelled faintly of something burned that wasn't tea wood. Long after the black tarp-covered truck vanished into the desert, the story of the Phoenix fire began taking on a life of its own. Social media posts from festival attendees started appearing within hours, showing blurry night photos of the sculpture before and after the blaze. At first, the images didn't seem unusual. Just another piece of Burning Man art destroyed by its own flames. But then someone zoomed in. In one photograph taken a day before the fire, through a narrow gap in the sculpture's steel ribs, a faint, pale shape could be seen. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but it didn't look like part of the sculpture. Some said it looked like fabric. Others said it looked like skin. Online, people began connecting Atlas to other unsettling events. A thread emerged about an unsolved disappearance at a desert rave in Arizona months earlier. The missing woman, known only by her stage name, had last been seen standing near a towering art installation, a melted cage of steel and glass. Archived photos of the artist responsible matched Atlas exactly, right down to the tattoos on his forearms. Another disappearance was tied to a pop-up event in New Mexico where a Firebird structure had been the centerpiece. Again, Atlas was credited as the creator. But the strangest part wasn't the connection to past events. It was how quickly these posts vanished. Every time a new thread gained traction, it would disappear within hours. Entire accounts were deleted without warning. Those who tried to repost the information received vague legal threats from accounts claiming to represent the festival. Some users even claimed their personal devices began behaving strangely after posting, files missing, hard drives corrupted, messages appearing unreadable. Meanwhile, the official narrative grew more absurd. Burning Man ES press office released a statement calling Atlas a performance purist who had left the festival voluntarily, leaving behind his sculpture to be destroyed in an unplanned burn. They offered no explanation for why no one had seen him leave or why the burn area was so perfectly contained. Photographers who had captured high-resolution images of the fire were denied entry to the festival's official archives, told their work had been confiscated for safety review. Within certain circles, people began whispering about an inner network within Burning Man, an invisible hierarchy of organizers, artists, and wealthy patrons who controlled what the public saw. In these circles, rumors about Atlas shifted. Some claimed he wasn't acting alone. Others suggested he might not have been the one setting the fires at all, but rather a supplier for something bigger. The most chilling rumor came from a camp member who had been assigned to help Atlas transport materials early in the week. She said the crates he brought into the desert were heavier than they should have been for hollow steel rods. She swore she had heard movement inside one of them. When she tried to tell her story after the fire, she was quietly removed from the festival grounds and told never to return. Despite the growing unease, most attendees carried on as if nothing had happened. Music still pounded from massive speakers. Flames still erupted from art cars rolling through the night. But for those who had seen the Phoenix before it burned, the memory lingered. An image of locked steel wings hiding something that was never meant to be found. And somewhere, in the background noise of the festival, the absence of Atlas felt like a shadow stretching longer each day. A week after the final embers of Burning Man's towering man effigy had cooled, the temporary city in the desert was being dismantled piece by piece. Crews in dust-covered goggles worked to restore the barren playa to its untouched state, hauling away scrap metal, wood, and debris. For most, it was an unremarkable part of the festival's end. Routine cleanup before the desert swallowed all evidence of what had happened. But for one small team of volunteers, the work took a disturbing turn when a shovel struck something solid buried several yards from where the Phoenix had stood. At first, they thought it was just another discarded piece of art, a forgotten box or a prop left behind. But the object was heavy, sealed shut with rusted latches, and half buried beneath a layer of hard-packed dust. When they pried it open, the smell that escaped wasn't the scent of the desert or the metallic tang of tools. It was sour, chemical, and wrong. Inside was a metal box barely large enough to hold a few books, yet it was crammed with dozens of small labeled USB drives. Each had a date and location scrawled on it in permanent marker, the earliest going back nearly a decade. Curiosity quickly turned into dread when one of the volunteers plugged a drive into a laptop. The grainy footage that appeared showed a dimly lit desert scene, the camera fixed on a half-finished sculpture. A man, Atlas, moved across the frame, dragging something limp and human-shaped across the sand. The figure was barely moving, arms hanging awkwardly, legs scraping against the ground. In the background, a fire pit glowed faintly, its embers casting a dull red light. The video ended abruptly as Atlas turned toward the camera, his face half hidden by a mask. The volunteers watched more files in horrified silence. Each showed different sculptures, some in the desert, others in abandoned warehouses or empty lots, always with Atlas present, always with an unconscious figure nearby. In some, the fires had already started, the flames climbing the structures while the victims were still inside. The most recent file was labeled with the year of the last festival and the word Phoenix. This one was different. It began like the others, but Atlas wasn't alone. Two men stood in the shadows, their faces partially illuminated by the flicker of firelight. They never moved to help the victim. They only watched. The footage ended before the flames consumed the camera's view. The volunteers debated taking the box directly to the police, but within hours, festival security intercepted them. Without explanation, the drives were confiscated, and the crew members were told their services were no longer required. That night, unmarked vehicles were seen leaving the desert, heading toward the highway without headlights. By the next morning, there was no trace of the box or its contents. The volunteers who had seen the footage received curt emails from festival administration thanking them for their work, but informing them they would not be invited back. Official records of the cleanup made no mention of the discovery. Only the people who had been there knew what they'd seen, and they understood why the Phoenix had been locked. why the fire had been so carefully contained, and why Atlas had vanished without a trace. Somewhere in those drives was the truth, and someone was making sure no one else would ever see it. In the weeks following the festival, the story of the Phoenix fire faded from public attention as if it had never happened. No official investigation was announced, no missing person reports were tied to Atlas, and no media outlets seemed interested in pursuing the whispers circulating online. For most, the desert had simply swallowed another strange chapter of Burning Man's history. But for those who had witnessed the events up close, the silence was unnatural, too deliberate to be coincidence. The FBI's involvement was never publicized, yet it was clear to a handful of insiders that federal agents had quietly entered the picture. Days after the cleanup ended, storage facilities in Reno were raided in the middle of the night. A few truck drivers who had been contracted to haul debris from the festival claimed their loads had been redirected to undisclosed locations. They described men in plain clothes and gloves unloading twisted metal under floodlights, speaking in low voices and never making eye contact. Atlas's name appeared on no official documents. His camp registration data, previously accessible through volunteer records, was wiped from the system. Even the photographs taken of his sculpture before the fire, images that had been shared and reshared in the days after, began disappearing from personal devices, as though they had been corrupted or erased remotely. Those who had archived the files offline found that they too were inexplicably damaged. Then there were the disappearances that followed. In the months after the festival, at least 4 people who had publicly posted about the Phoenix fire deleted their accounts entirely and were never heard from again in the Burning Man community. One had been a camp leader who claimed to have seen Atlas speaking with the 2 unknown men from the final USB video. Another was a volunteer who had handled the box before it was confiscated. Both left behind fully stocked campsites at smaller regional events, their possessions abandoned in eerie similarity to Atlas's untouched tent. Inside the community, a darker theory began to take hold that the festival wasn't just a cover for Atlas' activities, but part of a network far older and more organized. The sheer scale of resources used to erase the incident suggested more than just an overprotective event administration. It hinted at something coordinated, something with the means to watch, remove, and silence without leaving a trace. Some believed Atlas had been caught and was now under their control. Others thought he had always been working for them, his art a ritualized method of destruction staged for those in the know. Officially, the Phoenix fire became nothing more than an unfortunate accident in the annals of Burning Man history, a footnote in a long list of art pieces lost to the elements. But those who had been there knew it was a lie. The perfect circle of scorched sand had remained visible long after the wind should have erased it. Some swore that when the sun went down, faint heat still radiated from the ground, as if the burn was never truly over. Every year since, the festival has continued without interruption. New sculptures rise, new flames consume them, and new crowds cheer without knowing what came before. But for those who remember, the Phoenix remains more than just a burned piece of art. It is a warning. Somewhere, Atlas is still out there, or someone like him is. And when the firelight dances across the desert again, it will hide more than just the night. It will hide the truth Burning Man doesn't want anyone to see.